So this talk is going to be a little bit different than some talks. So this talk is actually going to be all live coding for the most part. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be building this website right here, which is I have running on a different port. So it's a game website, so you can go ahead and see some games, and we're just going to be getting to listing games. And in the version that I'm actually going to have in the notes that you can actually see, you'll be able to see like how to search for games and do a lot more. The data that we're going to be getting is actually going to be from an API, so grabbing asynchronous data. But I'm going to be teaching Ember a little bit differently than you may have seen in the past. In the past, you may have seen me use a lot of routes and controllers and didn't use components all that much. But Ember actually has a really great component story. So in this talk, we're going to be looking at building components first and understanding how things can work in a component mindset with Ember.js. So just to show you a little bit of behind the scenes, because I know with a lot of live coding, myself included, there's sometimes a tendency to kind of pre-bake a app that's already going to work really well. But I actually just installed this app a second ago. So all I did was install Ember CLI, generated a new Ember application. This is sort of like using Create React app or Vue CLI. And then I went into my application. And the other thing that I did is I installed Ember decorators, and that's more for the full demo that's inside of the application. So I'm going to be using ES6 classes, and to do some of the things for user interaction and some of the other extra features that you can add in Ember, that requires generators, and because generators are not baked into the language yet and are kind of still a stage 2 feature, and that proposal keeps going back and forth. It's not baked into Ember by itself, so decorators have to be installed, but that's the only add-on that I've done. And I've added one little line of style for some animation that we're going to be having in a minute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start this Ember server with Ember S, or we can use yarn start. And I'm going to try to put most of the code kind of towards the center of the screen, but since this is just one command in the command line, you may have to look down a little bit. And cool. So when you run yarn start with Ember CLI, it's like I said, it's like using something like Create React app or Vue CLI, where it comes baked in with a full server, and it gives you a bunch of starter code. Ooh, hello. So it gives us an app structure that's already built out, and like I said, I did add this app CSS that's being brought into the application. But from here, we can actually start to modify the application. Now, what we're dealing with in a user application is we're dealing with HTML. So in Ember, we have handlebars templates. And just in chat, say yes or no if you've used handlebars before. Okay, so there's quite a few yeses. So you probably have some opinions on handlebars, especially if you've not used handlebars in the Ember ecosystem. So kind of some background. Handlebars was a functional templating language that allows you to send some data into a function once and get data back. So Ember took this syntax and kind of ran with it and is now building very interactive kind of ways of describing HTML using this handlebar syntax. So if you've used handlebars before, don't be scared. Try to leave that behind and come with it with a fresh mind. And if you're interested in why Ember chooses handlebars, I gave a talk at last year's November on some of the optimizations of using something like handlebars can give rather than a syntax sort of like JSX, which you may be more familiar with. Which, by the way, in this talk, I'm hoping to make some comparisons and try to show you how it is actually similar to React or Vue. And in the notes that I'm going to be providing after the talk, I actually have the entire app built in React with some extra things like using the context API to provide loading of data and stuff. So here we have the application template for our app, and it just shows welcome to Ember. This is already created for us when we start our app. So here we can see it's just HTML, and we can ignore this curly brace outlet for just a minute. And it says welcome to Ember, and we can change this to welcome to NashJS. And everything is on a live reload server, so when we save, it's going to automatically update our browser. Now, that's not too crazy, not too interesting, but notice right here, we have this ID attribute. In some frameworks, it may yell at you about using IDs, or there might be a special syntax on how to bind those attributes to elements. But in Ember, any HTML that you have can be brought right over into your handlebars templates and pasted right in, so you're ready to go. There's nothing extra to learn to type in HTML. So what about classes? Well, we can just use class equals title. And this will actually mix and match with the handlebars syntax later. So everything you know about HTML can be used right here. I can even do styles. So let's go ahead and style this with some red text. Now this, my linter is actually yelling at me because the standard Ember CLI application comes with some linting rules that are opinionated, but this actually isn't a programming issue. This is just a linting error that it's telling me that we shouldn't use inline styles. We should use something like our style sheet or a separate library for styling. In fact, we can actually take this pretty far in terms of what we can do with our standard attributes. And we can actually even do things like on click. And we can even say like alert hello world. Now, we're using a JavaScript framework, so we're probably wanting events. And let me actually put this on a button so it's a little bit easier and more accessible. We're in a JavaScript framework, so a lot of these things like what happens when you click a button are going to be moved over to our JavaScript framework code. So using our components, or moving that into actions or state management. But let's say we have an existing HTML page and we're just trying to bring everything over first and then slowly embellish that. Even this on click just works. And if I inspect this element, there's nothing magical happening. It's actually an on-click attribute put in right onto the button. So yeah, if you have something like a blade template from Laravel or some old ASP templates, you can just bring that right into your handlebars and then start working and kind of move your application forward instead of having to abandon features and have to rewrite things. Okay, so we have the ability to write HTML in our app. And this application.hbs file is sort of like the app.vue or app.js component that's in a Vue CLI or React Create app out of the box. This is the entire application shown on the screen right now. So next, we're going to look at how we can actually start adding components. Go ahead and say yes if you've used a component library like React or Vue, and actually say like which library you've used before. Okay, so looks like a lot of people are familiar with React. A few people are familiar with Vue, and there's some like Angular and Backbone coming in as well. So with a component library, you're probably familiar with breaking up the HTML, the events, and the data, and all of the behavior for like a small piece of your application into its own JavaScript and template or render function, and then working from there, and then kind of building up an application from those components. And Ember allows you to do the same thing. Now, usually in teaching, like I said, we usually go from like routes, which is like what happens when the URL is at a certain point, and then kind of think from the outside in. But we're going to be looking from the components up in this talk. So I'm going to get rid of this button and start working with a new component. So we're going to call this component game tile. And like we would do in React or Vue, we're going to kind of call our game tile component, and we can even make this self-closing. And we can save this file. Now, when I save that file, the screen is empty, and this often happens in a lot of front-end frameworks where it won't render, or it renders an error page because something has broken in rendering. And now it's telling us that the component called game tile cannot be found. Now, in React or in Vue, we would do something like import game tile from like /gametile.js or .vue. And there is a future syntax. Uh-oh, why am I wagon wheel of deathing? What is going on? Okay, so sorry about that. My computer started freezing up there for a second. So kill Spotify. Do I have Spotify open? Oh, I do. So usually we would have to like import our components so that we know what components are available in our template. And there is actually a proposal to have a syntax called use that allows you to bring in the components that you actually need and rename them, and you can kind of alias them similar to JavaScript imports. But at least at this point in time, with Ember, things are a little bit different. So everything is kind of on a global lookup. And global lookup being global within your app or global within the route that you're in or the component you're in. So you do have to know how to name things just a bit, but our error actually kind of is giving us a suggestion of what things should be named. So in Ember, we can actually start by just describing kind of the HTML that we want for this component. If you think in React, this is sort of like having a functional component and just returning static JSX with no props, with no state, with no hooks now. So we can do the same thing in Ember. We can go to our templates directory, go to components, and create a new file called game-tile.hbs. Now, once we create this file, our app starts rendering again because this game tile component actually exists. And now we can actually start adding HTML for this component. So let's kind of describe the HTML for our game tile, and this is going to be a div with a class of game tile, and I'm using Emmet to kind of speed things up. I'm going to create an H1 with the title Doom. I'm going to put a span so that we can put the year in here. And then I just realized I don't have an image for Doom. I have an image for Overwatch. So I'm going to copy a little bit of HTML over here, and I'm going to change this back to Overwatch. I thought I could be clever by changing things up. And then I'm just going to put a small description. And when we have created the HTML for our component, our entire application re-renders, and there is a way to do hot reloading, but I'm just kind of showing base Ember right now. Our component is now rendering with all of the pieces of the HTML that we've described. Now, what if we wanted 2 games inside of our app? Let's go back to application, and I will duplicate this line where we created a game tile and save everything. So now we have 2 games showing up in our application, but it's the same game twice, and that's not super interesting. So we're about to dive into how to use attributes and how to use props, but I do want to go ahead and open it up real quick while I take some water and see if anyone has any questions so far. You can just do that in text chat for now. Is that a new syntax for components instead of using curly braces game-tile? Yeah, so right here I'm using angle bracket syntax, which if you're familiar with Vue or with React, you're probably thinking to yourself, this just seems normal. But in the past, you may have seen something like this, game-tile, which invokes the component. But that can easily get confusing because it's like, is this a property name? Is this a component? So now with Ember, we are able to use angle bracket syntax, and this has been around for about 6 months that you've been able to do this without any add-on. And this is kind of the way going forward, which brings it back into consistency with other frameworks as well as with the web component standard. Will, would there be an accompanying file for the logic that sits next to the HBS template? Ah, you're jumping a few steps ahead. So yes, there is a accompanying JavaScript file with handlebars templates if you need it. If you need a template only component, so if it's sort of like a stateless functional component in React, if you would, you can actually use a template only, and it gets super optimized by the renderer. Okay, so for components, not attributes. Yeah. So it gets super optimized by the renderer, and this is simpler. Like I said, this is like a stateless functional component in React, but even more kind of super hyper optimized. So now that we have some components on our page, let's look at starting to kind of customize these and make them a little bit different so that our 2 components stand out from each other. One thing that we could do is let's look at actually like styling these components. So one of the things that's really cool is, especially with angle bracket syntax, these components are actually just, they act really similar to regular HTML elements. So this means that we can actually add things like styles, IDs, and classes directly onto our components. So like, let's say that we wanted to have background blue. We don't have to all of a sudden complicate our component and add a ton of logic to be able to style it in that way if we want to just add a class to a single component instance or style a single component instance. We can actually do that directly on the component instead of having to go into our template and then start adding like if statements and taking in props or anything that kind of would start messing with our component's nice clean nature. Which is not the case for all frameworks. So I think in React, I know that in React by default, you can't do that. There may be like Webpack add-ons or something. Yep, there's Walker that allow you to make those customizations. We can even add classes as well. And I will show kind of some of the warts that are on Ember right now. There's ways to trim them off, but let's say that we wanted to give this a class of like second for styling or something that we had like a jQuery plugin or something in the background. So if I go ahead and inspect this element, notice that there's kind of this wrapping div around everything. So this is for kind of compatibility and legacy reasons that there's this wrapping div. But this is actually customizable and you can remove this wrapping div so that only the stuff that you declare in your templates show up when you create a component. But at least for right now, there's an extra wrapping div brought in. Did I miss something? Where is game tile defined name as game tile? Yeah, so it's a convention-driven design. So there is going to be there's actually an RFC or a request for comment for a syntax called use. So you would say like use game tile from components / game tile later. But this isn't the current syntax yet. So right now in Ember, that is based on convention in the framework. So how you name things. Yeah, similar to Rails. There's a lot of stuff that's similar to Rails in this because a lot of the devs came from the Rails ecosystem into Ember from the very start of things. So next we have two games that are both Overwatch. Let's actually start customizing those and bringing them in. So we can add regular attributes to our elements or to our components. And it's really easy to see that this is like HTML modifications that I'm adding to this. So if I wanted to add like a data adder, data foo equals bar, we can easily see that this is an HTML attribute and doesn't change the actual behavior of this component. But now we want to actually change the title in each of these components. So what we can do to send data into kind of the JavaScript land of our component, we can use the @ to say I'm passing in an attribute to my component, a like JavaScript attribute or an Ember attribute. So I can say that this title is Mario Party. And this title is Overwatch. Now, why is it yelling at me from here? Is it saying it's too long? Probably. So now we've passed in the title into our game tile, but we're not using that value yet. So what's happening is it's passing in the properties for our component, and now we can use them in our component template. So this is where we start using the actual kind of handlebars syntax. So we can use double curlies to inject a piece of dynamic data, and now I can use that at title value, which is the attribute or the property on our component. And now when I save this, notice it says Overwatch and Mario Party. Why does it say Overwatch Copyright. What the heck? Where is that? Oh, someone added that. Okay. You got me worried there for a second. I was like, why is it rendering weird? So now we're able to pass in our values to make this customized, so we can customize the data for each instance of this functional or template only component. And we can keep going into it and actually changing all of this to use dynamic data. So I'm going to go ahead and use @year. I'm going to delete the source of this image and use @image URL. And finally, I'm going to use @description. Now, when I save this, everything's going to be kind of gone. And that's because none of these other values are set. So I'm going to go ahead and copy some of my HTML that I have from before, wait for that little zoom thing to come down, and replace the game tiles we have for before. Can you define default properties? You can use like if statements. So you can say like if title, otherwise Overwatch, or like will golden. But there's currently not a way to define like defaults other than using your template helpers like if and else and that kind of stuff. But that is a good question. I think that as template only components become more common, I think having default attributes or default properties would be super helpful. But as we're about to start jumping into, we haven't even dealt with any like JavaScript side of things. So that arguably, like having default values could arguably be part of a, could be like having default property values or default attribute values could be kind of getting into where you need or where you would want JavaScript to go along with your template. So like I said, right now we have 2 different game tiles for 2 different games, but right now we're just passing this in directly from our application template and passing it in all as attributes that are hard-coded string values. So we're about to start looking at how we can work with JavaScript, and like Will had asked, how do we kind of combine JavaScript and logic with these components and start doing kind of more complex things with data? So we're actually about to start diving into that. But before we do, want to see if there are any other questions so far. I'm looking around for the doggo, and he's gone. What are the red squiggles for inline CSS? So the red squiggles for inline CSS is just the default linting rule. Recommends that you don't use inline CSS. It's not actually an error in rendering, so this is completely valid handlebars. It's just that the default Ember linting is like, hey, use a style library, or use Sass, or use something like component CSS or something like that instead of inlining things. But this was just an example to show anything you can do in regular HTML, you can do in Ember in the templates. Is there a lint config to change that squiggle setting? Yes. Here it is. Template lint RC. So it extends recommended, but I could customize it to whatever I want. So there's Ember, I don't know what this lint style exactly is called. But there's template linting, and there is ESLint built in by default. So both of those are configurable. Cool, cool. So next we're going to start working on building a list and actually taking the logic of finding all of the games that we have in our application and making that into a single component that knows how to load data. And it's going to be, if you're familiar with the idea of container components in React or in Vue, we're going to be building a container component right here. And we're kind of going to take steps towards doing that. So the first thing that we're going to do is copy both of these game tiles. And then we're just going to create a game list. So we're going to call that component. And once again, because we haven't defined the component yet, it's going to tell us that we can't find this game list component. So I'm going to go first by building a template. I like to build these templates first, and then kind of it lets me figure out if I can do things in just templates and just kind of have it stateless and logicless before needing to add any JavaScript to the page. So I'm going to take the HTML or the components that we had before, paste them into the game list, and we're right back where we're started, plus or minus one div. So now we have our different game tiles right here. And before we move on, I'm going to start looking at how we can start using JavaScript values. So far we've been dealing just with the template side of a component, and that's all you need for a lot of logicless things. So whether you're just showing some HTML or doing an each loop with some data that's passed in as an attribute, you can do a lot with just templates. But there are times where you need to start defining things like what happens when a user clicks on an element, or what happens when the element gets loaded onto the page, and how do we load data or interact with other things in our application. So I'm going to create a new component called game-list.js, and notice that this lines up with the template name in our application. Then I'm going to import component from @ember/component. And one thing I will say is that if you've seen me live code before, or if you go and watch some of the Embercast videos, usually I'm using, Ember has a lot of generators. So in the terminal, you could write something like Ember G component game-list. And this would actually create the basic JavaScript file and handlebars file for you. But part of the idea of this talk is kind of demystifying some of those things that you see in a lot of Ember demos. So I like to show that all this can be done by creating just JavaScript files and handlebars files in your application. So I'm going to extend from the component class. And now that my my class inheritance is set up correctly, our components are rendering again. Looks like there's something, oh. When did I get rid of the title for Overwatch? Cool. Are there any concerns about not naming your class when debugging? That's a good point. So I'm usually not overly concerned about naming my classes. So it's not like React where the class name is then used by the, where like you have to name the class or else it's not going to be set up correctly with the debugging tools and stuff like that. So like here I can see that I actually have my game list, and for some reason the Ember tools right now, I think there was a breaking change to something under the hood on how components are named. So like you see that this is named default 0423 for those template only components, whereas here I can see my game list. So I'm not as worried about naming my classes, because usually I usually have like my source maps and stuff turned on to where it doesn't matter as much, but you can name the classes anything you need to, so it's not going to break anything. Ember's just looking at what gets exported and makes sure that it's extending from component. So it doesn't matter if that's named or anonymous. So here, let's go ahead and create a new property called meetup on our game list class. And we're going to call this NashJS. And this is just to show like kind of how we can send data from this JavaScript file, which feels really detached and really far away from our handlebars. But we've just set a property on that actual class instance. So every game list now has a property called meetup equal to the string NashJS. So now when I go into my game list HBS, think of this as a render function inside of our component class. So I can talk to the component itself by referring to this. Let me go ahead and save that, and we can see kind of the name of the component and a little bit of info on it. And that's just calling toString on that value. And then let's go ahead and say this dot meetup. And I'm going to put this in an H3 and save this. And we can see that it's printing out the meetup value from our component instance. And if we had multiple game lists on the page, each component is a separate instance or a separate object. So they don't like cross boundaries or share data, unless you use JavaScript to share data, like have a shared, like if you have a shared variable up here that you're setting and using. But what we're wanting to do is we're going to want to work with an array of game objects. So I'm going to set up a constructor. Because it's usually generally best practice to set up arrays inside of a constructor instead of like here. Because if you set it here, it's shared across instances, whereas in the constructor, you are creating an instance of that array just for the single component. So I'm going to set this dot games equal to a new array, and I've got all of our data as an array of objects that I'm going to paste in. So this is the same data that we have in our attributes right now, just as an object instead of as those attributes. So like I said, we're kind of moving our way towards loading data from an actual server. So now that we have games and we have this array of games in our application, let's look at our game list and see how we can actually start working with this. So one of the things that's a little bit confusing to some people who are just getting started with Ember is that I can't just directly call JavaScript inside of our template. So if you're in React or in Vue, you might be familiar with doing something like this, .games.map, and then passing in a callback and returning in some JSX and stuff. But we aren't in a JavaScript file. We're in a handlebars file, so you have to do a little bit different syntax. So one of the things that I like to start by showing is the log function. And this kind of shows how these helpers or how these functions work in Ember. So I'm going to log this .games. And now when we go to, not Redux, now when we go to the console, we can see it logged our array of 2 objects. And I always like to show the equivalent JavaScript for everything that I'm doing. So this is the same as saying console.log this.games. Log is provided out of the box with Ember. We'll actually see near the end of this talk how to create our own functions in our templates to work with this. So like I said, if we were doing React, we would usually do like this.games.map. But I like to think about this a little bit differently and think about how we would do this if we were using Lodash, right? And it makes it a little bit better one-to-one comparison of how this function that we're about to use in Ember actually works. So if you think in Lodash, you can call lodash.map, pass in the array, and then pass in a callback, and here I would return some JSX. Let's look at what this would look like in Ember. So first, we're going to we need to know what the equivalent of like lodash.map or lodash.forEach is, and in handlebars and in Ember, that's each. Then we need to pass in the array that we're looping through. And next, we're creating a function as a callback. And you can actually do this in handlebars by using the as keyword and then 2 pipes. So this 2 pipes is my argument list. So I can create a game as the argument to my function. And now because this function has a body to it, has some chunkiness inside of it, it needs some code that we actually need to run for each item or as like the callback function body. We can do that by creating a each block. And if you're familiar with Ruby, yes, this is very Ruby, because this is one of the things that got adopted in handlebars from Ruby. So now we are looping through all of our games, creating a variable that only exists inside of this loop called game. And let's see what we want to do for inside of that loop. Let's go ahead and paste in one of our game tiles. And now we can save this. So what I've done now, let me go ahead and get rid of a little bit of this. Now what we have is we have a game tile for each item in our loop. But we're creating Overwatch twice. So what we're going to do next is we're going to look at how we can pass in our data, but I did see a few questions pop up. So Mason asked, is this just Handlebars standard syntax? So a lot of it is Handlebars standard syntax. So if you've not used Handlebars in a while, all Handlebars has switched over to this each as syntax and allowed you to create block components or block helpers is what they call them. And in all Handlebars, the block helpers act as if they are kind of callback functions. So if you're used to Handlebars from quite a while ago, you probably would know something like this, each this.games. And then one of the things that really stunk about Handlebars before was that like you would do each this.games, and now all of the properties that you talked about inside of this each loop would first look things up on the game that you're looping through. So like I said kind of earlier at the beginning when I was like, who's used Handlebars before? A big like scoff that I get that Ember still uses Handlebars is like this confusion over what is the current context and what is the value that I'm looping through. So not only Ember Handlebars, but all Handlebars has actually gone to kind of a clearer model of what is available to you. And that idea of like context switching is kind of going away in most Handlebars. All right. Are there any other questions before I go and show how we can actually pass in like the title for each of these games? All right. Cool. So what's cool is we've so far been passing in plain strings as all of the attributes to our components. But now what we can do is we can pass in the value. So we've created this temporary value, or we've created this callback argument called game. And we can say, give me the game.title. And this is data directly coming from our array. So now we can see Overwatch and Mario Party Ultimate are coming in directly from our objects after we've looped through, created this for each loop or this map loop, and started looking through our different data. So now I can put in game.year, game.image URL, and game.description. So now when we save this, we're now getting the data showing up from our array. So we're mapping over our array, creating a single game tile for each one, and passing in all of our values. And these don't even have to, like right now we have these matching, but in a minute we'll see that this really could be anything. And we could even mix and match handlebars and, or like, dynamic values and strings. So we can do string concatenation similar to template strings. So I could say like game title hello and add space hello to the end of any of our values. And if you're interested to kind of know what's going on under the hood, Ember is actually binding and watching all of these values separately. So if anything changes, it only has to update it only has to update the title, and it actually updates just that piece of the document fragment. Like I said, if you want to know a little bit more about that, check out my November talk or ask some questions when we go to kind of open hall at the end of the talk. So right now we're showing the list of games from an array in JavaScript. But everything has been synchronous so far. Everything has been synchronous or just hard-coded. So let's look at adding kind of some asynchronousy to this application. So I'm going to start by setting this.games to an empty array as our kind of starting state or our starting value. And then to simulate some asynchronous behavior, I'm going to just set a timeout. Like I said, we're moving one step at a time towards loading data from a server. And I'm going to set games after 2000 milliseconds. So in our constructor, we're setting games as an empty array. We're setting a timeout for 2000 milliseconds, and then setting our actual data. Now, when we do this, it looks like our app isn't rendering. So we check our trusty console and see that there's an Ember error that says you must use set to set the game's property. Now, if you're familiar with, if you're a Vue user, you're probably like, what the heck is going on? Because Vue kind of already sets up these observers, and you can just use standard equal signs because it's using ES5 getter and setters to do all of its observation and tracking. But if you're used to React, you're like, oh yeah, if the state changes after a while, you have to use this .set state, or you have to pass it in as a prop or do something that actually triggers rendering. You can't just change values on your component and just magically things appear. So the same thing's happening here. Once Ember has set up an observer, so once you've used a value in your template, you have to then start using this .set if you want to change the value after the constructor and after it's kind of pushed into the DOM. So what we're going to do is, instead of using this.games equals, we're going to use this.set and set the property for games. And we're going to set this equal to our array of values. Now, just to stay consistent, I'm also going to use this.set up here. So one of the things you'll notice is that, like in React and Preact, you have to mix like this.state equals and this.set state depending on where you are in your function. Ember, you can use this.set anywhere, and if observers aren't being used yet, then it's fine. So you don't have to like remember, oh, when is this going to run, and is the component going to be in a valid part where I can use set state or not. So now I'm going to reload this page. We can see nothing's happening, and then our data kind of quote unquote loads. And this is pretty cool, but it'd be nice if we had a loading state. So let's just track loading with a new property called this.loading. And I'm going to use this.set again. Or sorry, I'm going to set this to true because we're loading at first. And then inside of our timeout, I'm going to set this.set loading to false. Right, so once we're done loading our data, we will go ahead and unset that. And I'm going to change this to like 5,000 milliseconds, just so it's a little bit slower and easier to see during the presentation. Now, so far we're not doing anything with this quote unquote loading, this loading property on our component. So let's look at it. I'm just going to create this H3 right here and put this dot loading inside of it. So we can see it's true and then flips to false. So we have a true false value now that we can work with, and using functions, using callbacks, we can start actually manipulating what the user sees based on this loading state. So now that we have our loading value, we're going to use a new function in our handlebars called if. So we can say if this dot loading. And we're going to do a function body similar to what we did with our each loop. So if loading. So if we're loading, let's create a new H3 that says loading. And I've got a little bit of fancy animation right here. So I've just created an animation style called spin that I'm going to do for 4 seconds infinitely and do linear. And display block is just so that it doesn't spin like off the side of the page. It just spins in the place that it's in. So I'm going to reload the page. We can see loading. And then it kind of like goes away and shows up. And notice our console.log is also running anytime games changes. But none of our other code is running when games changes. So Ember's kind of efficiently figuring out what has changed in this template and only running that part of our code. Now this if statement is really nice, but it would be nice if we had an if else statement. So if we're loading, show the loading animation, else loop through our games and show the games. So now we have a little loading animation and we're showing our games. Next, we're going to go ahead and clean up a little bit of our asynchronous code to make it a little bit easier to read and to refactor it in a way that's going to be easy for us to move to loading data from the server. I'm just not a huge fan of having a bunch of callbacks or doing a bunch of work in a constructor. So we're going to move a lot of that out of this constructor and into a new custom function that we write. But before we do that, I want to check to see if anyone has any questions. Vue uses v4, game and games. Ember is using each this.games as game. Did you say multiple terms could be inside of those pipes? I may have misheard. Yes. So these pipes allow you to have multiple arguments. So it's item and then index for an each loop. But if you create custom components that kind of yield, and that's similar to like a render prop, you can have as many arguments as you would like. So think of this as your function arguments. And it's really based on, each is actually based on the original proposal for map and for each. No problem. Yeah, like Mason said, in Vue, you have to use v4, and if you want to use v4, you can do like a template tag. So in Vue, this would be equivalent to saying template v-4 game in, and then having your game tile inside of here. Is there an advantage to importing set and writing set this loading and false rather than this.set? Yeah, so what Sean's asking is Ember has something called Ember set. Which allows you to like set properties deeply nested on any object. It's similar to underscore dot push or set. I can't remember what the underscore equivalent is. I prefer, if you're working with this, I prefer this.set because you know that you're inside of a component. So you know that it's safe to use this.set. But if you're setting values on objects that are coming in as arguments or anything else, then using set from Ember object is nice because it works on native objects, Ember objects, and really anything that's not null or undefined. And my dog is going crazy in the background. Okay, so let's go ahead and refactor some of this code. So I'm going to go ahead and copy, or I'm going to go ahead and cut all of this code and call this.load data. Now, load data isn't anything special to Ember. We're writing it right now. So I'm going to create an async function and paste in what we had before just to make sure that everything is still working. And I'm going to reduce this to 2000 milliseconds. Now, because we have an async function and we're out of this constructor, so we can kind of organize our code a little bit better, we can start rewriting some of the stuff that we have. So we can await a timeout for, oops, and it always wants to import timeout from node when I do this example. So I'm going to await a timeout. And this is just kind of rewriting the code that we just had to make it work nice with async and await. But of course, there is no function called timeout. So I have this little helper function when I'm testing or demoing, this helper function called timeout, which just makes a promise out of window.set timeout. That's all that we're doing is we're resolving after a certain amount of seconds so that we can use await timeout, which is really nice and clean and easy to read. So we can see the same behavior that we had just before. Now, everything that we have hasn't had to change. We've got a loading state. We've got data coming in as an array. Let's actually load this from a real server. So I've created a small API called GameListAPI.herokuapp.com. so we can use window.fetch to actually work with this data. So I'm just fetching from the API URL, and we need to await this. And then I'm going to bring this in as JSON and call that games. Do you have to use window.fetch versus just fetch? No, you can use just fetch. And there's even, so I was just being explicit for the demo, but you can just use fetch. There's also plugins for Ember or add-ons for Ember that will make this isomorphic. So it will work if you're server-side rendering, and it will work if you're in a browser that doesn't support window.fetch. So it automatically polyfills that. So we are setting loading to false. Stop trying to make fetch happen. Fetch is never going to happen. And then we're going to set games to the actual games array that we're getting back from our API. Now this first time it's going to take a while because Heroku needs to wake up. So this might be a time for some questions. What was Ember's reason for enforcing this.set? So part of this.set is because unlike Vue, so Vue was made fairly recently in the idea. I'll get to that question in a second. And yes, we can actually add SSR. So this.set, especially coming from a Vue background, Mason, this.set is from older, it's kind of an older generation of things and a legacy side of things, where you have to be a little bit more explicit into calling the render cycle and calling when things are observed and updated and changed. Whereas like Vue, you can just say this.loading equals true, and it's using ES5 getters and setters because it's always supported only browsers that allow it to set up the wiring for that. Ember and React have a little bit more going under the hood to set up those observers and use this.set. In new versions of Ember in the future, you'll actually just be able to say this.loading equals true. And the only thing you'll need to do to make that work is you'll just say tracked loading. So in future versions of Ember, and actually you can do this with an add-on right now, you can define which properties are tracked, similar to Vue. You like set which, you tell it what properties you want to track and what properties are going to change, or else it like blows up and errors at you. So in Ember, you'll be able to define what properties are changing using decorators, and then it will say, okay, that's tracked. Now I can just use this.equals. This.set and this.get are also helpful in Ember because it allows you to do like nested setting. So I can say like loading state, loading.state, and even if loading isn't an object, it's not going to error out on me in any way. It's just going to, it'll be fine. So, Will, you're asking, the scaffold that Ember CLI generated here, is it a Node app? Does it handle SSR? So by default, the Ember application doesn't handle SSR, but there is something called fastboot. Ember fastboot, and literally you can just Ember install Ember CLI fastboot, and that adds server-side rendering to your application. Like I said, In the case of this app, we would have to add the node side polyfill for fetch, which is done via an add-on, and install Ember CLI fastboot, which we can do at the end of this after the demo. So we're actually loading our data. What's backing the app out of the box? Yeah, so it is a node server similar to how like Webpack or Parcel is running. There's even an Express server running, so you can do mock APIs locally. You can proxy your API requests and everything. So yeah, there is Express running under the hood alongside of all the build tools. So we're actually loading our data, but nothing is showing up. And that's because our server has a little bit of a different name for the properties that we have than our components and then the attributes that we're passing in. So if we look at our data that we're still logging, we can see that the property that we used to call title is now called name on our game objects. So let's go ahead and update some of our template to reflect this. Now we could go into our game tile, and probably what you would actually want to do is pass in like the entire game object, assuming that you know that like all of your game objects are going to look the same. But I actually like kind of this idea of keeping it simple and just passing in all of my props. So I'm going to type in game.name. The year is actually this first release date, which is a timestamp that we're going to have to do something with. The image URL is actually cover.url. And here we can see we can even work with deeply nested objects. And if cover's undefined, it even like will early return undefined. So it won't break on us if like cover's undefined and then we're trying to look up the URL on an undefined object. And then description is actually called summary. So here we can see this is coming back, and we can see the two games. It just happened to return two different Bethesda games. And there is one thing that's interesting about this API because it uses cookies to know who's requesting this. So when I'm calling fetch, let's actually say credentials is include. And now we can save this. So now we're going to be passing in our cookies, which hopefully gives us back the same games, which is nice because it doesn't go over my rate limit for the game API that I'm actually grabbing data from. But it also means that this game wish list app, when you can actually search for games and add them to your list, all of that is just using cookies. So that's kind of a little hack that my server has so that I don't have to write a bunch of authentication for a demo. So we have our game list, and finally we need to change this, this timestamp into something that's actually meaningful and usable. And this is where these custom functions inside of our handlebars come into play. So like I said, we can't just say new date and then get like dot to year, or sorry, what is it? Full year, get full year. We can't do this in handlebars. It's going to break and tell us that this is not a valid template. So we have to create a function so that we could pass something in. So like, let's call this, we'll call this function timestamp to date. And it's going to take in like a date time or a timestamp, right? So we'll pass in our timestamp, which is our game first release date. So if you think of the JavaScript equivalent, we're just, we're passing in something to a function called timestamp to date. So what we can do is we can call timestamp.toDate and pass in our value. Now what's happening, if we go to inspect and hit console, it tells us that the timestamp to date function is not a helper. So what's happening here is it's telling us we have to actually define this function. So it's kind of like tried to call undefined or whatever. Like timestamp to date isn't actually something that we can use yet because it's undefined. So this is once again where the naming conventions of Ember happens. So we can say, we can go to helpers and create a new timestamp-to-date.js file. Will asks, is there anything in Ember similar to React's error boundaries? So I'm not familiar with what React's error boundaries are. Maybe during like the microphone session, we can chat about that more. So Ember will kind of consolidate where the rendering errors happen. I think this might be what you're talking about. And like if one component fails to render, it doesn't fail the rest of the application. It tries to consolidate that to the first component it fails in. So everything else kind of continues rendering around it. Sometimes that single component might be hosed, but other components usually are okay, unless it's in the initial render, and then if it's in the initial render, it kind of breaks. Now, helpers, I do have to say, I usually use the generator for this every time. So I'm having to like look at my notes more than usual, because usually in an application, you kind of write your helpers or import them from NPM, and it just does everything you need. You don't write these as much on a day-to-day basis as you do with components. Because once you have a few of them set up in your application, you're usually done. So with this helper, it's a little bit weird how functions work in handlebars. So you have both named attributes and ordered attributes. So the helper actually takes in an array of values. So our timestamp is actually the first value in this array as our first argument. Don't worry, if you use the generator, it actually creates this for you. So now we're going to create a new function called date. Or we're going to create a new item called date and call new date, pass in the timestamp, and let's return date.get full year. So now we can see when this game is actually coming out, which is helpful, but, and that's what I originally had planned for the demo, but there's nothing stopping us from making this return kind of a formatted date. And yes, we could even import moment and start using like moment.js to do this formatting, but it's pretty self-explanatory, or we can actually do a lot of stuff with just what's built into native JavaScript. So let's go ahead and call get month. Is it get month? I hope. No, that's not right. Get month plus one. Ship it. Yeah, there we go. So now we're passing in and we're getting the month, the date, and the year that each of these items are are done. Let me tell you about the time I rewrote moment because I thought it was clever and too lazy to Google it. Yeah, I almost definitely would probably just say like import moment from moment and just return this, or even more likely, if I was writing this in my production applications, I was like, I've already paid the cost for moment, so it doesn't hurt too much. There's a common add-on that allows you to just use moment formatting right in your template. So you could say like moment format oh gosh, why do I keep doing that? Moment format and then say like, month, month, day, day, year, year. But we're using just native JavaScript right now. So now we have that set up, and we haven't had to change anything else outside of that. So if that timestamp to date logic changes, we can actually update that logic, and it would update across all of the templates and all of the components that use this timestamp to date function. So now that's about where kind of the demo ends. I can open things up for questions, or we can look at kind of compare and contrast the React example, or look at some of the code for the like finished quote unquote version, this first one that I showed over here, to see how things like Ember services and other features kind of can get integrated into the app later on. So like building on top of this component structure that I have showed so far. Cool. You can also ask questions in the chat if you don't feel like unmuting yourself as well. Hey. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Oh, something just muted. Yeah, I'm looking at the participant list. So I think where he was going with that was talking about Ember Data. So one of the things is that, especially if you go to like the guides right now for Ember.js, the guides will show you how to use something called Ember Data, which is a very opinionated way of loading all of the data into your application. And it like you can set up models. So if you're familiar with something like a server-side framework like Rails, or if you're familiar with using GraphQL with Apollo, and in Apollo you have your, I think that they're called resources. But like you say like, go fetch this model and these properties, instead of using like window.fetch, which in a large application, that's what we're doing. I would say 90% of the time, except for like read-only things where we need smaller objects and we don't want tracking and like create, read, update, destroy. We just want to do like get some data, put it into Pojos, show it to the user, throw it away. Then we'll use like or we'll use fetch or Axios or something like that. But in the case of like when I'm doing create, read, update, destroy, yeah, I'm definitely reaching for some of the tools like routes, which allow you to kind of bake in asynchronous behavior and show loading states. And that's built into the framework, telling you like, if this route fails, go redirect over here, or before trying to load the data for this piece of the application based on the URL, make this check. And there's a lot of API surface to that. And that's definitely something that we reach for as we build more and more complicated apps, similar to if you were using React, you probably wouldn't just use React. You would use something like Redux, or you would use hooks or context to start building your state. You would start using React Router to help you deal with the URL. You would start using other libraries to build up what is your full application. It's just that Ember comes with a lot of those more out of the box, but you can start with components and build a pretty substantial application without ever having to reach for routes or anything like that. Like you can even start incorporating services, which is kind of the state management or the application management system in Ember, similar to React Context. You can use services without ever having to touch routes or controllers or anything else. I know Will said he wanted to see this server-side render, so. Let me make sure that I've got everything installed. Ember.js seems to point away from servers. Is it easy for Azure or better paired with another? So Ember is actually similar to React, where everything that it builds is a static application. So I can put this application that we just built on something like surge.sh, which I can do here in just a second as well. And it's really easy to do that. Now, if you're using server-side render, so if you're using Ember CLI fastboot, that's just an express application. So you can deploy that application to, I usually use Heroku just because it's super easy and it saves me a bunch of time to not have to deal with my operations and all that kind of stuff. But I've hosted those Ember CLI fastboot apps on Azure, AWS, DigitalOcean, Heroku. I've set up like Doku boxes. I've hosted it on bare metal. It's just a node app if you decide to do server-side rendering. If you don't use server-side rendering, then it's just an HTML file, a JavaScript file, and CSS. And let me check. I think with Ember fetch, I have to import fetch. And it's probably going to yell at me that it's using. Oh. What is doing the building under the hood? Is there a way to eject for advanced config? So one of the things with Ember, I didn't try this for server-side rendering, so it's totally possible that this breaks. So one of the things with Ember is that it uses Ember CLI, which is using Broccoli under the hood. So in the Ember ecosystem, there are these things called add-ons. So think of add-ons as like NPM packages with a ton of kind of like default config under the hood. So if you've ever used Parcel and you've used Parcel plugins, where like you can just add a plugin and it's configured by default and you don't have to do anything, then an add-on is very similar to that. So like, for instance, blah, blah, blah. So like Ember CLI Tailwind, if I wanted to add Tailwind to this application, I can just Ember install this add-on. And it will, and by running Ember install, it's going to bring in all of the dependencies it needs. Yeah, server-side rendering, borked things. Sorry, Will. Server-side rendering made things not work. So let me go to package.json and clear that out. So actually, I tried to just now install Ember CLI fastboot, which is like the entire server-side rendering framework for that. I will get server-side rendering posted and post it, but probably not in this little demo. So like you can see Ember decorators. It configures decorators and a ton of other configuration in the build pack. But then there's configuration files so that you can actually go into these add-ons and configure them and add extra configuration to them. And then if you want something that's like configuration for your own application at runtime, there's a environment config that allows you to configure what's going on in your application. And this doesn't have to be just framework specific stuff. So we put like, where's our API hosted in here and import that from our application in our production applications as well. But there isn't an idea of like ejecting. So one of the things that's cool with Ember is you don't have to ever eject. So you can build custom Broccoli plugins or custom Ember CLI plugins or even custom Webpack plugins that work with the build system. And you don't have to touch any of the other add-ons. You don't have to eject and kind of have this huge config file that you then have to manage at the end of the day. Everything is kind of self-encapsulated, and for the most part, unless they're doing something they're not supposed to, add-ons don't hurt each other's add-ons and don't change your config globally too much. If that answers your question, Mason. Yeah, thank you. Let me go ahead and put up the notes for this. So if you want to like at home follow along or try this at home. Or see the React example or the final finished example. Let me go ahead and put that in here real quick. And I'll also put this in Meetup, the Ember Discord, and the Slack group as well. Thanks for everything except for the wall of red. That's Will's fault. It is Will's fault. This is telling me that your app was running in fastboot and couldn't find Ember fetch, and then probably was telling me that I was trying to request information from a domain that I didn't set in my security group. Fetch wasn't going to happen. Hey, if I used jQuery Ajax, it would have been fine. So yeah, I posted the link. It's github.com/r/tablata/ember-component-first. Like I said, if you're here from the group, if you're here from the Slack group, I'm going to go ahead and post it in there. Oh, why did it just go ahead and it just copied everything from my console that was yelling at fastboot. And if you're here from Ember Discord, I'm also going to post it over there. If you would like to learn more about Ember, like I said, embercast.com is something that I'm going to promote one more time. Of course, I'm a little bit biased, but I think it's one of the best ways to get up and started learning Ember.js. We have that free video if you want to get started, and then we've also got these full courses, and if you're interested in the full courses, DM me and you can ask me about more information about those. If you'd like to keep up with the Ember ecosystem, there's emberweekly.com, which is a weekly newsletter where you can get information about what's happening in the Ember ecosystem, so new add-ons or new security updates. We also keep track of all of the RFCs, all of the like important and kind of best articles and blog posts, all of the add-ons that are updated or are new for the week, new videos and events, in your area. And keep an eye out on Ember.js.com. The guides are also really good. Like I said, they right now dive into routing and a bunch more of the Ember application, but there's actually currently an effort to make it so that these Ember guides teach components first, so it's a little bit more familiar, a little bit easier to understand and get the idea of you're editing UI and then adding routes, adding services, adding other behavior. But the tutorial right now is awesome and allows you to do like a full test-driven application out of the box, walks you through it step by step. And if you'd love to hang out with the Ember community, go ahead and jump in this community tab, and there is a link to the Ember community Discord where you can join, talk with us. Of course, I'm always in the JavaScript channel in NashDev, and there's also a #Ember channel as well. So yeah, like I said, if there's any more questions, I'm free to take those. I'll be around for a while. If not, thanks for coming by. I need to double check. I would need to double check on that. Yeah, Will says to be determined. The speaker had canceled. That's right. I remember he said that. If we do have one in December, we will definitely let everyone know through the usual means and Twitter. We, as organizers, we'd love to know your feedback on how the remote meetup went as well. Like we said, this is kind of a trial that between today's weather and organizers and schedules and timing and everything. This worked out really well. We want to know like how this went, and usual housekeeping. We're always looking for sponsors. And if you want to talk, message myself, Josh, Will, or Russ in NashDev. And I think, did we end up getting the Google form set up to submit talks? Yeah, direct message one of us or post in JavaScript that you're interested in talking. Or if you know someone like a coworker or someone who might be interested in talking, don't like CFP for them, but if they maybe aren't in NashDev or are from out of town and are coming in, let us know and we'll get you the information on how to become a speaker. And if you've never spoken before, also let us know and we'll help you to work on your talk and get that going as well. Will saying, if there's a speaker you'd like to talk remotely or that otherwise couldn't come, let us know in case the remote format works and opens some options up for us, which is very cool. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we'll likely try to have either a Zoom call or a Twitch stream for any meetups going forward where possible. Yep. So cool.